Curating Portraits. I'm Clarissa Levi, Art and Heritage Counsel at Wedlake Bell.
And I'm Richard Harwood. I'm a barrister at 39 Essex Chambers.
And we're joined today by Imogen Gibbon, Deputy Director and Chief Curator of Portraiture at National Galleries of Scotland's Portrait Gallery. And we're absolutely thrilled to be talking about portraits with you today. So, to get us started, we wondered if you could tell us a bit about how you came to be where you are in your early career.
Well, I fell in love, I suppose you could say, with history of art in the last couple of years at school, having never really had any affinity for the subject or really knowledge about what the subject was all about at school, and did it for A-level and just fell in love with it, really. I seemed to take pretty quickly to remembering images and imagery and making connections between all of those things. So I went on to study art history at the University of St Andrews. And again, at St Andrews, within the 4-year degree system, you can mix that up with various other subjects. So supplemented with medieval history, classical civilization, psychology even at that point. And so specialised eventually with art history, and then left university and made it down to London without having a point of contact really to begin my professional career there. So I was just taking potluck by making the journey from St Andrews, and got a job at the Royal Academy as a security guard, which was very interesting. At that point, the security for the Royal Academy was hired in from a security company. So it was different to actually being a member of staff for the Royal Academy, which is clear that that's not what we were. And I think the company back then, long time ago, was called Trident Security. And they also did security for a number of other London museums and galleries, including the Harwood Gallery. So I was mainly based at the Royal Academy and did a bit of a stint at the Harwood Gallery as well. Various memories from that time, just absolutely fascinating, watching everything unfold on a day-to-day basis from the very beginning of the day when the gallery opened to the closing, and making secure of everything before leaving for the day. I remember Princess Margaret swishing through the galleries very quickly, looking like she wasn't actually looking at the exhibition, but I'm sure she was in some sense. I did a stint in the lift, actually operating the lift at the Royal Academy, because I was deemed to look one of the neatest in my uniform. So it was a very tiny lift, if anyone knows the lift at the Royal Academy. So I would not fancy being in there in the summer months, but literally up and down, driving the lift, so to speak. So that was interesting, if not a little bit confining.
Well, having done the exact same journey to London without a point of contact from St Andrews, I must say I think that sounds like a really cool first job. And you must have seen all kinds of things behind the scenes at the RA. I think that sounds really fascinating beginning to your career. How did you come to be at the National Galleries of Scotland then?
Well, I was just about to add something there. I think another one of the things that absolutely fascinated me about working galleries and museums, having visited them, is seeing that door and seeing people disappear and go through doors that weren't available for the public. I thought, what happens behind those doors? Anyway, I know only too well now. I hope, however many, almost 3 decades later, that transparency in relation to what we do in museums and galleries and how we work so much more closely with audiences is much more apparent now. So after the security job, I had my first curatorial job. I spent 5 years at the National Maritime Museum. I was curator of historic photographs and ship plans, again, which was really interesting, having done some volunteer work while I was at university at the Scottish Fisheries Museum in Anstruther.
You did not?
Yes.
That's my favourite museum in the whole world.
Oh, gosh, it's amazing, isn't it? Yeah. It's fascinating. I must actually make a point of going back and seeing the museum now. I have been back fairly recently, but not in the last year or so.
I'm a bit obsessed with the Anstruther Fisheries Museum. I used to make my parents take me as a birthday treat.
Gosh.
It had an eel. Anyway, this is completely off topic. I'm so sorry, Imogen.
No, and I remember cataloguing ship plans, never thinking that I would actually end up at the National Maritime Museum a few years later. But goodness, that stood me in brilliant stead. And that was amazing just to see and to meet the people that worked there and dedicated their life to that topic. Absolutely amazing. So yes, National Maritime Museum, and had an excellent grounding there from my then line manager, a fascinating, brilliant man. And I learned a lot and still carry that through with me now, which always makes me so keen to support early career colleagues here at the National Galleries of Scotland. I think that's a really, really, really important part of being in a leadership role or a management role at wherever you work. So that was a sort of good connection to have. And then I transferred my almost but not quite photographic knowledge of ships in photographs and ship plans to portraits, and saw a job advertised at National Galleries of Scotland for, although the title was curator, it's more or less an archivist role at National Galleries of Scotland Portrait Gallery. So was keen to return to Scotland. And yeah, luckily I was successful in being appointed. I remember preparing for the interview. I remember going on a school trip to the National Galleries of Scotland, never to the Portrait Gallery, but to the National Gallery and the Gallery of Modern Art, but not to the Portrait Gallery, which I was less familiar with. And I remember being in Waterstones on Piccadilly about a week before my interview, and I found a history book that was written in 1985 by a colleague actually who still works with us here at the National Galleries of Scotland about the history of the Portrait Gallery. And I thought, it's a sign. This niche book I found in Waterstones.
Amazing. And Imogen, so what's the work of the Chief Curator of Portraiture? What's your job?
So I provide, I suppose, and deliver strategic direction for our programme, which includes exhibitions, not limited to, but includes exhibitions and displays, both temporary and of the collection, strategic direction in relation to a programme, acquisitions around developing the collection, and again, as I just briefly mentioned, supporting the curatorial team here at the Portrait Gallery and nurturing their development from, the moment they join us to their time here. We also work a lot with all departments across the National Galleries. You can imagine we have curatorial, finance, digital, conservation, collections management. I mean, I'm not going to name check all of them, but there's a multitude of departments and expertise at NGS. And the magic thing is, you strike up a conversation about particularly maybe an artwork in the collection or an exhibition idea that you've got, and you find that spark of interest in colleagues across the organisation, not necessarily within the curatorial department, out with. So yeah, it's fascinating. And I've worked for a couple of decades actually at National Galleries of Scotland in various roles, and I never wake up in the morning and think, what's coming today? Let's get there and see what happens.
I'm very interested. I mean, people are very interested in thinking about the collection and how it develops, because it started off as one thing and, of course, it grows over time. So how do you go about developing and building your collection?
Well, now that is a question that's a thesis on its own, Clarissa, but I'll try and maybe demystify in my answer and give a summary. So National Galleries of Scotland, we're made up of National Gallery, Portrait Gallery and the Modern Gallery. And we have one collection that spans over those areas. There's 130,000 is the number that we use, objects in the collection. The National Galleries of Scotland Act from 1906 recorded the establishment of a board of trustees which looked after and delivered the responsibilities then of the Scottish National Gallery and the Scottish National Portrait Gallery. From 1906, we were known as the National Galleries of Scotland. Subsequently, 1985, the National Heritage Scotland Act 1985 gave more, I suppose, detailed responsibilities for the Board of Trustees, which obviously included the Gallery of Modern Art as well. So that's how we got to our 3 sites in Edinburgh. And one of those responsibilities is to care for, preserve and add to the objects in their collections. So, in other words, developing the collection through acquisitions. Acquisitions, there's a variety of ways which we can acquire works, we can purchase them, we can be lent them, we can be bequeathed works, and there's various, I suppose, levels of engagement. We can go out and seek those works, and often, probably more often than actually us going out to seek those works, people approach us and say, we've got this are you interested? And you talked about how do you actually go about developing? Of course, we get so many offers, we can't accept everything. Even if we have a gift, which is an absolute brilliant, generous offer from donors, there's always costs associated with ensuring that we have that object while it's in our care, that we care for it. It might need to be framed, glazed, prepped for display. So you have to balance priorities, I think, with where we want the collection to head for future generations.
You have a clear strategy as to what you want to do with the collection, how you want to grow it.
Yes, we do. And actually, that's a very pertinent point, because we're just in the middle of revising our collection development framework, which will set us into a new set of priorities around developing the collection. I mean, one obvious area which has been overlooked until recently is work by women artists. And for the case of the Portrait Gallery, collecting more portraits of women sitters as well. So that's definitely a focus for us over the next 5 years. Our collection development framework spans a period of 5 years, and then it gets revised every 5 years.
So if I can ask, well, we all know that museums don't have pots of money sitting around for acquisition budgets these days, if they ever did. And so how do you go about acquiring works by female artists and of female sitters? How do you do that?
So one way specifically within the portrait collection that we do that is we commission. So we commission portraits of women sitters, and we commission women artists to make that work. The commissioning project, I suppose if you can call it a long-term project, we never commissioned portraits before. I think it was around about 1982 was when we first started to commission artists to make portraits of living figures. We never did that before the early 1980s. So that was a new theme of developing the collection, which we opened up in the early 80s. And we don't have a definitive number of portraits we commission during a year or during a 3-year cycle. It's really dependent on funding and sponsorship in relation to that. So that is definitely one way that we would be seeking to proportionally add, I suppose, to the number of works by women artists in the collection.
You've obviously got, as in common with many major museums, a large body of work that you don't have wall space for. So what about, I think it's called in America, can I completely disgrace myself by using this expression, shop your closet?
Oh, yes. Love it.
Can you have a look in your store to see, and what's that like?
Well, so I was just trying to gather the figures in my mind this morning. I mentioned we have around about 130,000 objects in the collection, 130,000 artworks. At any one time, we have between 93 and 97% of that collection not on display. So between 3 and 7% is always out there. And that can be on display in our 3 sites in Edinburgh. That can be out on loan. That can be as part of touring exhibitions. And that can be as part of long-term loans. We have a huge number of works which are permanently out on long-term loan. And even then, it's between 3 and 7%. So you can imagine a visit to our store is in itself a wondrous thing. And I was just thinking how we're sort of recently not so much using the word store, because those works are working while they're not on display. They're being researched, they're being looked at by curatorial conservation colleagues, other colleagues across the organisation. Content is being made. We have a digital team at National Galleries, and we've made various films with guests actually talking directly in front of the artworks in the store. So I like to think of those artworks as, because they're not on display doesn't mean they're not working.
It's interesting, the statutory responsibilities, one we've touched on, is to care for, preserve and add to the objects in the collections. Another is to secure the objects exhibited, but also to secure objects available to persons for study and research, and then a more general function of promoting the public's enjoyment and understanding of fine arts. So there's a balance between those, particularly with the 93% or so, which you simply don't have the opportunity to put on public display at any one time.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, things change for all museums and galleries once the arrival of the internet and online collections. And there's various different ways that visitors can access content now, not just about the works that are on display. So that's great. Our contemporary purpose we refer to as making art work for everyone. So if you take those 1985 statutory responsibilities, you can see how they feed into that phrase and that purpose about making art work for everyone. I just want to mention one of our projects we're working on at the moment, which is called the Artworks. So we have a current store in the Granton area of Edinburgh, and that's over 20 years old. And the Artworks is a project that has been in planning for a number of years. It's going to be a new state-of-the-art home for the National Collection, and it will be on a site adjacent to our current site in Granton. So we're at a certain stage of Ariba planning at the moment, and just in the sort of critical stage of looking at fundraising for that project. But that really has been developed as part of the Granton waterfront regeneration in Edinburgh. It's been from the outset thought about in relation to the community that it is going to be part of. So that's, I think, taking all of those statutory responsibilities and really, really making the artwork for everyone.
Well, as art as a contribution to regeneration area and a contribution to the heritage regeneration area.
Absolutely, yes.
This sounds like the antithesis of... I once had a really fascinating exchange with a curator of an institution which had taken a large gift under the acceptance in lieu scheme. So it had taken a lot of objects and had undertaken to present them to the public, to give them public access. And they wanted now to change their display. And it was my job at one point to go and ask, right, what's happened to all these things that are supposed to be on display? Like, where are they? Whilst they were doing various works on the building. And the curator explained that they wanted to change things up because they wanted to have changing displays that, as you said, really worked for everyone, not just a dusty old mausoleum. She said, what was it? She used an expression which I loved, a mausoleum to a 19th century collector's taste. She didn't want to get stuck in the past. And the difficulty was that, of course, they kind of were stuck in the past because they had accepted these objects and undertaken to give them public access. So they had that obligation. How do you balance making art work for everyone with also the obligations that you have to display certain objects and not change that?
For me, and I think for how we work here at NGS, it's about thinking about the multitude of contexts for each individual artwork. And that changes depending on what display or what exhibition the artwork is going to be featured in, where it's hanging. Might not be part of an exhibition or a display, but what are you saying by the very act of making the decision that you either still need to display that object or that you want to display that having it been part of the 97% that hasn't been on display. So for me, it's feeling, it's engaging with, as a curator, as a creator of content, not letting the object necessarily speak for itself, although that is part of it, It's about exploring how we want to present that work to audiences, how we can make that relevant, how we can make people leave the gallery at the end of their visit. And if they take one thing away with them from having engaged with an artwork, then that's great. So I think for me, interpretation plays a really important part in that. And it's never static. It's never static. I mean, we have a great system of feedback for our visitors, whether that's online or in person, and we are regularly responding to emails around style of interpretation or how we can develop it or how we can improve it, or is it of interest? What else do people want to know? So I think for me, that's probably the answer, interpretation. I mean, just out of interest, we have a new interpretation framework and we have a tone of voice guidelines. Very simple: generous spirit, revelatory storytelling, creative energy.
That's amazing.
So it's not the dusty mausoleum approach. It's the interest in the object. And is it a sense that the interest of a work of art may change over time because how you understand or perceive what you're looking at and how that itself is perceived? You got the work which you've been doing on the sort of the coal industry. And that is something which sort of people's sense of that will have sort of changed dramatically over the last 50 years.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll touch on the Before and After Coal exhibition shortly as a brilliant collaborative project between audiences and colleagues at NGS and an artist as well. So I sort of think about it like this. If you had the same artwork, you looked at a wall label from 50 years ago, 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, and you look at what you want to say about that today, there's no way those two bits of text would be the same. You know, you would be looking to probably push up some information that previously would have been your first sentence in that wall label from even 10 years ago. So that leads me on to the Before and After Coal exhibition, which was a recent exhibition at the Portrait Gallery, and it's now touring across Scotland this year. And it explored the history and lasting impact of the coal industry through the photographs of American photographer Milton Rogovin, who came over a few years before the miners' strike and took photographs of miners and the mining community, their families at home, at work, at leisure. And for this exhibition, we worked with ex-miners and ex-mining communities, and they really came together and they made this exhibition. So it's a great example of how we can prioritize the lived experiences and the voices of the people that are represented in those photographs.
Yeah, because dramatically, I mean, my father started out as an apprentice mine surveyor at 16. My grandfather was a coal miners and so on from those sort of communities. And that's all, this is in Derbyshire, but that's all completely changed. They've gone, those jobs have gone. The old colliery site is now Sports Direct headquarters. There is a complete change in the nature of work and employment and what goes on in those communities, and sort of reflecting, remembering how that's come about and what it was like is simply incredibly important.
Absolutely. And just as an example of how we carried that collaborative working with audiences together through for that exhibition, rather than having a usual evening private view at the gallery, we had a miners' gala day. And as part of the project, some of the young people involved had made mining banners looking at the legacy of the previous use of imagery and everything. And we had a walk or a march with those banners and the communities we'd worked with around St Andrew's Square.
And some good brass bands, I hope.
Yes. Well, I think it was a silver band, actually. Remembering having a detailed conversation about the difference on the day. But it was brilliant. And, you know, it's something that will live long in the memory, I think, of everyone involved and those of us working at NGS. It's wonderful to behold. And then there was a point when we arrived back at the gallery for that morning and the exhibition opened, and each of the miners that was there had the space in front of the audience to stand up and to say their name and to say the pit name where they worked. It was absolutely, you could hear a pin drop. It was amazing.
Well, I think that's exactly why we all care about heritage, and that's the most beautiful description of your job that I could have possibly asked for. So after that amazing project, what projects have you got at the moment that you're excited about?
Well, so one project that I'm working on is next year in the autumn, we will be welcoming at the Portrait Gallery the Scottish Portrait Awards, which has been an awards that has been running since 2017, not organised by National Galleries of Scotland, organised and managed by the Scottish Arts Trust, but for the first time we'll be hosting it here at the Portrait Gallery. So really looking forward to that. One of the most exciting bits of my job, I think, is working with contemporary portrait artists and seeing what they're doing. I had an interesting experience last year. We were involved with the Sky Portrait Artist of the Year show, and I was invited to be a judge in the final of that, which was pretty nerve-wracking, but gosh, what an amazing experience. Brilliant. And the eventual winner, Brogan Bertie, he painted Lorraine Kelly, and that portrait of Lorraine joined the collection.
It's so exciting and so vibrant that you're doing these really contemporary things. And I must say, very on brand, Imogen, to be having these involvements.
And I think one of the other things that's always ongoing, which I love about my job, and I was remembering the other day, I can remember this encounter distinctly, just going back a little bit in time to the early 17th century. Now, I don't think you think I'd mention this person this morning, John Napier, the inventor, if that's the right word, of logarithms. We have a portrait of John Napier in the collection, and ages ago, I had a researcher who wanted to come in and look at other reference images we had of portraits of John Napier. And I looked at the portrait of John Napier, and he has really long fingers in the portrait, sort of not in an El Greco style, but you could actually believe this man had that proportion of fingers. Anyway, the researcher suddenly said, "I'm a descendant of John Napier." And I looked at her hands. She had long fingers.
Gosh.
And I thought, wow, what a connection from, late 16th century, early 17th century. And now I'm with a descendant of John Napier. So moments like that, brilliant.
Well, amazing. And you were also talking earlier about, in a previous discussion that we had, about sport in art, which I think is a really interesting part of your job as well. So tell us about curling.
Right. Thank you for giving me time to talk about that, because that's, again, one of my passions as a sort of failed sports person. I thought, well, I know a bit about art history. Why not add sport to the mix, which I did. So, yes, a long time ago, I curated an exhibition here called Playing for Scotland, the Making of Modern Sport. And as part of that, I did research all across Scotland, tried to connect with all the sporting national governing bodies, one of which was the Royal Caledonian Curling Club, still known as that, but more known now as Scottish Curling, and they have a wonderful collection, heritage collection. We have a number of curling paintings in the National Galleries of Scotland collection, and to gain more knowledge and expertise about those depictions, I reached out to Scottish Curling, and even now, 15 years after actually initially reaching out to them, I have an excellent relationship with the Scottish Curling Trust, which looks after their collection, and in fact going with one of the board members next week to have a look at a potential interesting curling depiction, which we might add to the collection. So yes, it's a live thread of mine that's always interesting. And also having recently participated in facilitated and in conversation with Rona Howie, formerly Martin, who was skip of the Team GB curling team that won gold in the Winter Olympics in Salt Lake City in 2002. So extending from 19th century to people who are curling today. Fascinating.
No one can say that your job isn't varied.
Exactly.
So what would you say is your very favourite thing about your job?
Oh, and I might grumble about this when it happens on an hour-to-hour basis, but I think it's the unpredictability of what might land on your desk at any given time, because it is never not interesting, I can say that. And especially specialising in portraiture, photography, you're involved in so many stories about people working with artists. So there's a wide remit for things to be landing on your desk. So I think that's it.
That's wonderful, Imogen. Later on, I've got plenty of questions for you about Anstruther Fisheries Museum. And I want to hear again those words about tone of voice, because those really were words to live by. This has been an absolutely fascinating conversation and so delightful to talk to you today. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it immensely. Thanks both.
Thank you for listening to the Art and Heritage Law Contested Heritage. Please do follow or subscribe on Apple or Spotify podcasts to enjoy more shows.
We have a new podcast out every fortnight. If you're able, please take the time to rate us and put down a review.
The show is also on the 39 Essex Chambers website, along with podcast series on topics such as artificial intelligence, climate change and planning.